In the warm heart of South Africa, nestled among the quiet hills and green fields, a baby boy was born in the summer of 1918. His name was Nelson Mandela. In the Xhosa language, Rolihlahla meant pulling the branch of a tree, a playful image that also hinted at something deeper, someone who might cause a little trouble, who might shake things up. People would later say it was the perfect name. Rolihlahla was born in the tiny village of Mbizo, along the banks of the Mbash River. His family was part of the Thembu people, a proud tribe with a long and noble history. His father, Gadla Henry Mfakani, was a respected local chief and counselor to the Thembu king. Though the family was not rich in money, they were rich in culture, tradition, and pride. From a young age, Rolihlahla showed signs of curiosity and determination. He loved to ask questions and explore. He didn't always follow the rules, but not out of disrespect. He simply wanted to understand the world better. He played stick-fighting games with other boys, climbed trees, and listened carefully to the stories told by the elders. His life was simple, close to the land, and filled with the wisdom of his people. At the time, South Africa was deeply divided. A system of racism called apartheid had not yet officially begun, but injustice and inequality were already everywhere. White people held most of the power, while black South Africans were treated as second-class citizens in their own land. No one in Mbizo could have imagined that this curious little boy, Rolihlahla, would grow up to challenge and eventually defeat that system. When Rolihlahla was still a toddler, his family moved to the nearby village of Kunu, where he would spend the happiest years of his childhood. Kunu was a peaceful place, surrounded by rolling green hills and open skies that seemed to stretch forever. The people lived in small round huts with thatched roofs, cooked over open fires, and helped one another like an extended family. Rolihlahla's days were filled with boyhood adventures, chasing animals, herding cattle, swimming in the river, and pretending to be warriors with his friends. At night, he sat by the fire and listened to the elders tell tales of ancient kings, brave fighters, and the customs of the Thembu people. These stories taught him who he was and where he came from. His father, Chief Gadla, believed deeply in justice and fairness. He often settled disputes between villagers and always tried to do what was right. He taught Rolihlahla that leadership was not about power, it was about serving others. But when Rolihlahla was only 9 years old, his father became ill and died. It was a devastating loss. Everything changed after that. The family could no longer afford to stay in Kunu. However, Chief Janjantaba, the acting king of the Thembu people and a close friend of Rolihlahla's father, stepped in. He adopted Rolihlahla as his own son and brought him to live in the royal household in Pekazwini. It was the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one filled with new responsibilities and powerful lessons. Living in the royal household was a great honor, but it was also a serious responsibility. Rolihlahla was now surrounded by leaders, counselors, and elders who expected discipline and maturity. The royal court was a place of learning not just from books, but from observation and experience. He studied in the local mission school, where he learned to read and write in English. But the real lessons came from watching the traditional leaders. He saw how they held meetings, listened to everyone's opinion, and made decisions carefully and respectfully. No one shouted. No one interrupted. Even the youngest or poorest person had the right to speak. Rolihlahla learned that true power was quiet, thoughtful, and rooted in wisdom. He also began to understand the injustices of the world around him. He noticed that the government passed laws that favored white South Africans and ignored the needs of black communities. He asked questions. Why were things like this? Was it fair? Could it be changed? These questions grew in his heart like seeds. At night, he would sometimes stare at the stars and dream. He dreamed of a country where people were treated equally, where skin color didn't decide your future. The lessons he learned in the chief's household shaped his sense of justice, dignity, and purpose. He was no longer just a boy from Kunu. He was a young man with a vision. As he grew older, Rolihlahla was sent to a series of mission schools and then enrolled at the prestigious University College of Fort Hare. It was a school for black students from across southern Africa, and it offered a chance for a brighter future. He studied hard, made friends, and joined the student council. But even here, injustice followed. The school was controlled by white administrators, and black students had little say. When Rolihlahla joined a student protest against unfair policies, he was expelled. He had stood up for what he believed in and paid the price. To avoid an arranged marriage planned by his guardian, Rolihlahla ran away to Johannesburg, the bustling heart of South Africa. The city was loud, crowded, and full of energy. It was also a place where racial inequality was even more obvious. Black people lived in poor townships and were forced to carry passbooks, which restricted their movement. They worked in the mines, on the railways, or as servants, often for very little pay. Rolihlahla took on odd jobs. He worked as a cleaner, a night watchman, and later, a clerk at a law firm. In Johannesburg, he met teachers, activists, and workers who were tired of being treated unfairly. He began to see that change was possible, but it would take courage, sacrifice, and unity. He also began to learn about politics and the law, tools that could be used not for violence, but for justice. Many years earlier, when Rolihlahla first entered a British-style primary school, the teacher gave him an English name. This was a common practice in colonial schools at the time. The name she chose for him was Nelson. No one asked Rolihlahla if he wanted a new name. No one explained why his Xhosa name wasn't good enough, but he accepted it quietly, as so many children did. It became the name he would use throughout his adult life, Nelson Mandela. Still, he never forgot the name his parents had given him. Rolihlahla, the troublemaker, the one who pulls the branch, the one who shakes things up. That name was a part of his identity, just as much as his traditions, his people, and his dreams. Even as he walked through the streets of Johannesburg or sat in classrooms filled with books, he carried Kunu in his heart. He remembered the stories, the hills, the songs, and he remembered what his father had taught him. Never forget who you are, and always fight for what is right. In the fast-paced streets of Johannesburg, Nelson Mandela found himself caught between two worlds. By day, he worked at a law firm run by a white lawyer sympathetic to the struggles of black South Africans. By night, he studied long hours through the University of South Africa, determined to earn his law degree. It was not easy. Mandela had to balance work, studies, and the constant pressures of life in a racially divided city. But he didn't give up. After completing his studies, Mandela achieved something remarkable. He became one of the first black lawyers in Johannesburg. For many people, it was a source of pride and inspiration. Alongside his close friend, Oliver Tambo, Mandela opened a law firm, the first black-run legal office in the country. They called it Mandela and Tambo Attorneys. Their office quickly became a place of hope for many. People came from the townships and rural villages, bringing stories of injustice, unpaid wages, forced evictions, police violence, and laws that punished them simply for being black. Most couldn't afford legal help, but Mandela and Tambo often charged little or nothing. Day after day, Mandela sat across from mothers, workers, and elders whose lives were torn apart by unfair laws. He listened, advised, and fought in courtrooms that were often stacked against them. But more than that, he began to see how deeply the system of apartheid was rooted in every part of life. He realized that changing individual cases was not enough. The entire system needed to change. As Mandela listened to the stories of his clients and walked the streets of Johannesburg, the ugly truth of apartheid became clearer and clearer. Apartheid was not just a few unfair rules, it was a system designed to control and separate people based on the color of their skin. It told black South Africans where they could live, where they could work, and even whom they could marry. Black families were moved from their homes and forced to live in crowded townships. They needed permission to travel into white areas, and they had to carry passbooks, special ID documents that police could demand at any time. If they forgot or lost their pass, they could be arrested. Schools for black children were poorly funded and overcrowded. Hospitals and public services were separate and unequal. Even the justice system was tilted against them. A black person's word was often not accepted in court against a white person's. Every corner of life was touched by inequality. Mandela grew more and more outraged. This was not just wrong, it was deeply unjust. He knew that silence was no longer an option. If he wanted a better future for his children and his people, he had to act. The laws were meant to break their spirits, but Mandela's spirit only grew stronger. The time had come to rise, speak out, and demand change. In his search for justice, Mandela turned to the African National Congress, or ANC, a political organization that had been formed decades earlier to fight for the rights of black South Africans. At first, the ANC had relied on petitions and polite appeals to the government, but the government did not listen. Now, a new generation of leaders, young, energetic, and determined, was ready to try something bolder. Mandela joined this youth movement with passion. He believed that real change would only come through strong, peaceful action. Alongside others like Walter Sisulu and Oliver Tambo, Mandela helped form the ANC Youth League. They believed in African pride, unity, and resistance. Mandela quickly became a key figure. He helped organize nonviolent protests, wrote speeches, and encouraged people to believe in their power. He wasn't just speaking to the oppressed, he was building a movement. In meetings, he spoke with clarity and conviction. In the streets, he marched shoulder to shoulder with workers and students. He believed that black people should not feel ashamed, they should feel proud. He also believed in peace. Mandela did not want hatred between races. He dreamed of a South Africa where all races could live together in harmony. But as his influence grew, so did the attention from the authorities. The government began to monitor him closely, watching his every move. Still, Mandela pressed forward. He had joined a cause greater than himself, and there was no turning back. By the 1950s, apartheid had grown even more brutal. New laws were passed almost every month. Black South Africans were forced out of their homes, banned from entering certain neighborhoods, and required to show passes even just to go to work. Those who refused could be beaten, arrested, or worse. In response, the ANC launched the Defiance Campaign, a massive, peaceful protest that encouraged people to break unjust laws on purpose. Volunteers entered whites-only areas, burned their passbooks, and sat in segregated benches. They were arrested in huge numbers, but they went willingly. Their goal was to expose the cruelty of apartheid not just to South Africa, but to the entire world. Mandela played a central role in organizing the campaign. He traveled the country, gathering support and rallying communities. He urged people to stand together, not with violence, but with unity and courage. The campaign made headlines around the globe. For the first time, the international community began to take notice of what was happening in South Africa. Mandela became known as one of the movement's most powerful voices. His ability to inspire without hatred made him a symbol of hope. But the government responded with more violence and tighter restrictions. They arrested leaders, shut down protests, and tried to silence the ANC. The battle for justice had begun in earnest, and Mandela knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. Despite the dangers, Mandela continued to speak out. He traveled far and wide, meeting with farmers, factory workers, church leaders, and university students. His message was always the same: freedom, dignity, and equality for all. He told people that change would not come overnight. It would take sacrifice. It would take bravery. But he promised that it was possible. South Africa, he said, could be a place where every child had a future, regardless of the color of their skin. People began to call him the Black Pimpernel because he was so often on the move, avoiding arrest while continuing his work. He appeared in secret meetings and public gatherings, always urging people to stand tall. His calm, steady voice became a light in dark times, but his rising influence made him a target. The government arrested him more than once, hoping to break his spirit, but each time, he emerged stronger. Mandela refused to be silenced. He had made his choice not to live in comfort, but to fight for what was right. He once said, "I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society. It is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." These words showed the depth of his commitment. Nelson Mandela had stepped fully onto the path of resistance, and there would be no turning back. Throughout the 1950s, Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress, ANC, continued to focus on nonviolent resistance as their primary method of protest. They believed in the power of peaceful actions, organizing boycotts, strikes, and stay-at-home protests that paralyzed the economy and disrupted the status quo. Mandela was convinced that change could be achieved without resorting to violence. The message was clear: the people of South Africa could stand together and demand their rights. But as the ANC's protests grew, so did the government's oppression. Police brutality became a common response to any sign of dissent. Tear gas, rubber bullets, and beatings became the routine tools of the police. In 1960, a devastating tragedy occurred in the town of Sharpeville. Thousands of black South Africans gathered in peaceful protest against the pass laws. But without warning, police opened fire, killing 69 unarmed people, most of whom were shot in the back as they tried to flee. The Sharpeville massacre shocked the world. International outrage spread across the globe, and protests erupted in cities everywhere. But for Mandela, the tragedy marked a turning point. Could peaceful protests continue to make a difference in the face of such brutality? Could a system built on violence ever be brought down by nonviolence? Mandela, like many others, began to question the path of peaceful resistance. In the wake of Sharpeville, the ANC was banned, and the government cracked down even harder. Though he remained committed to nonviolence, Mandela knew that the struggle was entering a new phase and that the cost of resistance was about to become much higher. After the Sharpeville massacre, the government moved swiftly to suppress the ANC. They banned the organization and arrested many of its leaders, including some of Mandela's closest allies. At the time, it seemed as though the movement had been crushed, but Mandela had a different vision. He knew that the struggle for freedom was far from over. Mandela went into hiding, moving between safe houses and using false identities to evade the police. His ability to remain elusive earned him the nickname the Black Pimpernel. Even in hiding, he remained a symbol of resistance. He continued to organize protests, send messages to the people, and keep the spirit of the movement alive. But the time spent underground wasn't just about hiding. Mandela used this time to study and learn. He read books on revolutionary leaders from around the world, Mahatma Gandhi, Fidel Castro, and other figures who had fought against oppressive regimes. Mandela studied military strategy, learned the art of resistance, and thought deeply about the future of the struggle. As he moved from place to place, he realized that the movement needed a new plan. The peaceful protests, while essential, weren't enough on their own to break the power of the apartheid regime. Mandela was not just a protester now, he was becoming a national leader, one with a clearer understanding of the need for a more comprehensive and radical approach to the fight for freedom. In 1956, after years of organizing protests, Mandela, along with 155 others, was arrested on charges of treason, an accusation that carried the death penalty. The government had hoped that arresting Mandela and his comrades would break the momentum of the movement, but they underestimated the resolve of the men and women they had imprisoned. The trial lasted for more than 4 years, dragging on from 1956 to 1961. Throughout the long process, Mandela stood firm, refusing to back down or apologize for his beliefs. He remained calm in court, holding his head high. He knew the charges were baseless. This wasn't about law or justice, it was about silencing the voices that demanded change. During the trial, Mandela and his fellow defendants made it clear that they were not traitors. They were patriots. They were fighting for a better South Africa, a country where everyone could live in freedom and equality, regardless of their race. Mandela and his co-defendants argued that it was the government, not the people, that was betraying the country's values. In 1961, after 5 long years of waiting, the court declared that all the defendants were not guilty. Mandela was free, for the moment, but the government wasn't finished with him. The battle for freedom had entered a new phase, one that would demand even greater sacrifices. After his release, Mandela's life became even more dangerous. The government had not given up on their mission to crush the resistance. Mandela knew that if he stayed visible, he would be arrested again, so he went deeper into hiding. He began using many different identities, dressing as a gardener, a driver, and a laborer. His life was now lived in secrecy, moving from one safe house to another, never staying in one place for too long. Despite the danger, Mandela continued his work. In 1962, he secretly left South Africa and traveled to other African countries to meet with leaders and garner support for the struggle. He also traveled to London, where he spoke to international audiences, urging them to boycott South African goods and put pressure on the apartheid regime. While in exile, Mandela trained in guerrilla warfare and strategy. He had come to realize that the fight for freedom would require more than just nonviolent protest. He needed to equip the ANC with the tools to challenge the government directly. When he returned to South Africa in 1962, however, he was arrested almost immediately. Someone had betrayed him, and the police were waiting for him at the airport. Mandela's arrest marked a turning point in the struggle. He was no longer just a leader of protests, he was now seen as the most prominent figure in the anti-apartheid movement, and the consequences of his arrest would be far-reaching. Mandela was charged with leading a campaign of sabotage against the government. The sabotage had been carefully planned to avoid harming any people, but the government saw it as a direct challenge to their authority. Mandela was put on trial once again, this time in 1964, and the stakes were higher than ever. In the courtroom, Mandela made a statement that would echo in history. He addressed the court with calm determination, explaining that his actions had been motivated by a desire for freedom, justice, and equality. He said, "I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society. It is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." His words were powerful and moving, not just to those in the courtroom, but to people around the world. It was clear that Mandela's commitment to the cause was unwavering, even in the face of death. In 1964, after a lengthy trial, Mandela was sentenced to life in prison. At just 46 years old, Mandela's life was now in the hands of the state. But as he was led away to prison, he walked with his head held high. His body was imprisoned, but his spirit remained free. Though it seemed like an end, it was just the beginning of a new chapter. Mandela's imprisonment would only strengthen the resolve of the anti-apartheid movement, and he would become an even more powerful symbol of resistance. The struggle for freedom was far from over. In 1964, Nelson Mandela was sent to Robben Island, a notorious prison located off the coast of Cape Town. The island was an inhospitable place, cold, windy, and isolated from the mainland. Mandela's new home was a small, dark, damp cell with no bed, only a thin mat on the stone floor. The conditions were harsh, and life in prison was grueling. He and the other prisoners were forced to work long hours in a nearby quarry, crushing stones under the hot South African sun. The physical labor was exhausting, and the stones they broke were often too hard to crush effectively, making the task feel endless. The prison guards tried to break Mandela's spirit. They used every tactic they could think of to degrade him, limiting his visitors, confiscating his letters, and restricting his access to books. They treated him unfairly and with cruelty, hoping to force him into submission. But Mandela refused to let them strip away his dignity. He understood that the real prison was not just the bars and walls, it was the loss of hope. He would not let the apartheid regime take that from him. Despite the harsh conditions, Mandela maintained his sense of purpose. He stayed focused on the larger struggle for freedom and justice, finding strength through his thoughts and beliefs. His spirit could not be imprisoned. Even in such isolation, Mandela remained a leader. He inspired his fellow prisoners to stand firm, and they began to see him not just as a fellow prisoner, but as a symbol of strength and resilience. Mandela spent 18 years on Robben Island, a period that would shape the man he became and the legacy he would leave behind. During this long imprisonment, he maintained his unwavering resolve. Despite the harsh treatment, Mandela remained focused on his vision for a free South Africa. He used his time in prison to educate himself and others. The prison became a makeshift university, with Mandela and the other political prisoners creating their own University of Robben Island. They shared books, exchanged ideas, and engaged in deep political discussions. Mandela read extensively, studying law, history, philosophy, and literature. He wrote letters to the outside world, keeping his political beliefs alive and staying informed about the situation in South Africa. His mind was a tool that no one could take from him. Over the years, he gained a reputation as a wise and patient leader. But more than just educating himself, Mandela mentored younger prisoners. He shared with them the values of discipline, respect, and peaceful resistance. He taught them that the struggle for justice was not just about fighting an enemy, it was about embodying the ideals of equality, dignity, and nonviolence, no matter the circumstances. Mandela's quiet strength became a symbol of resistance not only for his fellow prisoners, but for oppressed people around the world. The world outside may have forgotten about him for a time, but inside the prison, Mandela was shaping the future. He remained steadfast in his belief that one day, apartheid would end. His endurance became a beacon of hope, and the world began to take notice. Nelson Mandela was more than just a man, he was a movement. Even though he was physically locked away in Robben Island, Mandela never lost his connection to the world outside. He and the other prisoners communicated secretly, sending messages through trusted visitors or hidden in food and clothing. Each message was carefully crafted to give hope to the outside world and to share strategies for continuing the resistance. Mandela's messages were often coded or hidden, but they carried powerful messages of resilience and hope. In prison, Mandela refused to allow the guards to strip him of his humanity. One of the most famous acts of defiance was his refusal to wear the standard prison uniform of short pants. He said, "I am a man," and insisted on wearing long trousers, a small but significant stand for his dignity. Mandela's dignity did not go unnoticed by the guards. Over time, some of the prison officers began to see him differently. They respected his calm demeanor, his unwavering resolve, and his ability to maintain his sense of self despite everything. Some of the guards even sought his advice, asking for guidance on personal matters or political questions. Mandela's power came not from his ability to be forceful or angry, but from his deep belief in justice and the quiet strength that flowed from his patience, kindness, and inner conviction. As the years passed, the apartheid regime's grip on power remained firm, but the international community began to take notice of Nelson Mandela's imprisonment. In the 1970s and 1980s, protests erupted around the world demanding his release. The slogan "Free Nelson Mandela" became a rallying cry for millions of people. From the streets of New York City to London, Paris, and beyond, people stood in solidarity with the anti-apartheid movement, and they made it clear that they would not tolerate injustice. Politicians, musicians, and celebrities joined the cause. International musicians, like Peter Gabriel, The Specials, and U2, wrote songs calling for his release, and concerts were held to raise awareness. Global organizations, such as the United Nations and the Commonwealth, condemned apartheid, and many countries imposed economic sanctions on South Africa. Mandela's name became synonymous with freedom. Though he remained in prison, his image as a symbol of resistance and dignity grew. His imprisonment made him a martyr in the eyes of millions, and his story galvanized people around the world to fight for freedom and equality. The apartheid government tried to silence him, but they couldn't stop the global movement calling for his release. Mandela, locked away on Robben Island, had become a symbol of hope, and the world's pressure was mounting. The walls of apartheid were beginning to crumble. While Mandela sat in prison, the struggle against apartheid continued. Protests inside South Africa became fiercer. Young people led demonstrations in the streets, often facing violence from the police and military. The government responded with increased brutality, but the resistance only grew stronger. South Africans were determined to fight for their freedom, and Mandela had become the face of their struggle. Mandela's name was whispered in the quietest corners of the country. It was written on walls, painted on protest banners, and sung in the streets. "Free Nelson Mandela" became a universal cry, and the spirit of resistance grew louder with each passing day. Even though Mandela could not speak publicly, his silence was profound. It spoke volumes about the power of conviction and the endurance of the human spirit. Mandela became more than just a political prisoner. He was a symbol of peace, of resistance, and of the possibility of a better future. His name gave courage to the oppressed, and his legacy became a beacon of hope. Even in prison, Mandela's influence was felt around the world. His story was not just a tale of suffering, it was a story of triumph, the triumph of the human spirit against seemingly insurmountable odds. The fight for freedom in South Africa was far from over, but the world was beginning to change. Mandela's moment was coming, and with it, the possibility of a free South Africa. By the 1980s, South Africa was a nation on the edge. The oppression of apartheid was taking its toll on the people, but it was also fueling their fight for freedom. Protests across the country grew in number and intensity. Students organized mass marches, chanting for an end to apartheid, while workers went on strike, refusing to work under the unjust conditions imposed by the government. The global community stood in solidarity with the oppressed people of South Africa, with countries imposing economic sanctions to pressure the apartheid government into change. Nations around the world refused to trade with South Africa, and major companies withdrew their investments from the country. The world was watching, and the pressure on South Africa's leaders was becoming unbearable. Despite the increasing unrest and demands for freedom, the apartheid regime tried to maintain control, but it became clear that the system of racial segregation was no longer sustainable. People throughout the country were demanding justice, and the calls for Nelson Mandela's release grew louder. The government could feel the weight of the world's attention bearing down on them. Yet, in the face of this growing resistance, Mandela remained a figure of calm and hope. He knew that the world was listening, and that the tide of history was turning in favor of the oppressed. In his heart, he believed that victory was inevitable, and that one day, his people would be free. For him, the journey was not just about political change, it was about the triumph of human dignity over hatred and injustice. After 27 long years of imprisonment, Nelson Mandela walked free on February 11, 1990. His release was not just the end of a personal battle, it was the beginning of a new era for South Africa and the world. The moment was monumental. Mandela, older and grayer, stood on the steps of Victor Verster prison, holding the hand of his wife Winnie Mandela and raising his fist in the air. The crowd outside erupted into a wave of joyous celebration. People from all walks of life gathered, singing and dancing in the streets, while cameras from all over the world captured the historic event. It was a day the world had been waiting for, a moment of immense significance for the anti-apartheid movement. Though he had been imprisoned for nearly 3 decades, Mandela did not harbor anger or bitterness. When he spoke to the people, his voice was not filled with revenge, it was filled with a message of peace, hope, and reconciliation. He acknowledged that the struggle was far from over, and that South Africa still had a long way to go. However, the end of apartheid was now within reach, and Mandela's journey from prisoner to free man marked the beginning of the country's journey toward peace and equality. Following his release, Nelson Mandela returned to lead the African National Congress, ANC, which had been banned under apartheid. The political landscape in South Africa was fragile, with the country still deeply divided by years of racial injustice. Violence and unrest were widespread as apartheid supporters and anti-apartheid activists clashed. But Mandela, now a symbol of unity, chose a different path. He did not call for retribution or revenge against those who had enforced apartheid. Instead, he called for reconciliation and a peaceful transition to a democratic society. Mandela met with government leaders, including those who had once imprisoned him, and began negotiating the terms for the peaceful dismantling of apartheid. He told his supporters, "Let us forget the past and build the future together." His leadership, calm demeanor, and willingness to engage with his former enemies brought hope to a wounded nation. Mandela's goal was not only to liberate South Africa from apartheid but also to heal the deep racial divisions that had torn the country apart for so long. He understood that true freedom meant peace and unity, not violence or vengeance. In 1993, Nelson Mandela and President F. de Klerk, the last president of apartheid South Africa, were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their roles in peacefully negotiating the end of apartheid. It was a moment that highlighted Mandela's extraordinary ability to forgive and his unwavering commitment to building a new South Africa where all races could live together in peace. The following year, in 1994, South Africa held its first free and democratic elections. For the first time in history, Black South Africans could vote. The country came alive with excitement as people queued up to cast their votes, many of them for the first time in their lives. The long lines were a symbol of the power of the people, and the nation seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. On May 10, 1994, Nelson Mandela was inaugurated as the first Black president of South Africa. In his inaugural speech, he declared, "Never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another." Mandela's victory was not just a personal triumph, it was a victory for freedom, equality, and the human spirit. South Africa was entering a new chapter, and Mandela stood as its moral and political leader. He had gone from prisoner to president, from symbol of resistance to symbol of hope and renewal. As president, Mandela faced the monumental task of uniting a nation that had been deeply scarred by decades of racial division and violence. He worked tirelessly to build bridges between Black and white South Africans, using his leadership to promote reconciliation and healing. One of the most powerful moments of his presidency came during the 1995 Rugby World Cup. Rugby had traditionally been a sport associated with the white population, but Mandela saw an opportunity to bring the nation together. He wore the jersey of the national rugby team, the Springboks, and publicly cheered for them as they went on to win the World Cup. This act of unity was symbolic. Mandela understood that healing South Africa would require both symbolic gestures and real, tangible change. The sight of a Black president cheering for a traditionally white sport united the country in a way that words alone could not. It was a moment of healing, and the crowd's spontaneous chant of Nelson Nelson signaled a deep, collective sense of national pride. Mandela's leadership was not just about government policy, it was about leading the heart of the nation. Mandela's presidency was marked by a focus on nation building and the promotion of national unity. He sought to create a truth and reconciliation process, where those who had been responsible for apartheid-era atrocities could confess their crimes in exchange for amnesty, with the goal of fostering forgiveness and reconciliation. Mandela knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he remained steadfast in his belief that South Africa's future could be one of peace and equality. Nelson Mandela's vision for a united South Africa was encapsulated in the term Rainbow Nation. He believed that despite the deep divisions caused by decades of apartheid, South Africa could become a place where people of all races, cultures, and backgrounds could live in harmony. The country, with its complex mix of ethnicities, languages, and traditions, would no longer be divided but rather woven together, like the colors of a rainbow. Mandela's dream was a society where people celebrated their differences instead of using them as a basis for hatred or division. To bring this vision to life, Mandela focused on rebuilding the country's economy and infrastructure, especially in the impoverished communities that had been most affected by apartheid. He implemented programs aimed at providing housing, healthcare, and education to the black population, who had been systematically deprived of these basic rights under apartheid. His government worked tirelessly to offer economic opportunities to those who had been denied them for generations, and he emphasized the importance of creating a better future for South Africa's youth. Mandela also established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, chaired by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, which sought to uncover the truth about the atrocities committed during apartheid. The TRC allowed victims and perpetrators of human rights violations to come together and share their stories. It was not about retribution, it was about healing. Mandela believed that only through forgiveness and understanding could the nation truly reconcile its painful past. He understood that justice had to be accompanied by compassion, and his belief in the healing power of forgiveness became one of the core pillars of the new South Africa. Mandela's term as president was groundbreaking and filled with immense challenges, but he never viewed it as his personal victory. His vision for the country was always one of collective liberation, and he was acutely aware of the need to create a democratic society that was truly inclusive of all its citizens. By the time 1999 arrived, Mandela's presidency had led South Africa through its most difficult transition. But rather than seeking to hold on to power, Mandela chose to step down after serving a single term. He believed that the foundation for a strong democracy was not just about elections, but about leadership that inspired service to others, rather than personal gain. His decision to step aside was not without sacrifice, as many South Africans wanted him to stay. But Mandela's vision was bigger than any one person or position. He had never sought power for himself, he had only ever wanted the freedom of his people. In relinquishing the presidency, he sent a powerful message about the importance of democratic governance and the need for a peaceful transfer of power. Even as he stepped down, Mandela remained a symbol of hope and resilience. He passed the torch to his successor, Thabo Mbeki, with dignity, and his presence in South African politics and the world stage continued to be a guiding force. Mandela's willingness to allow others to lead showed that true greatness lies in serving others, not in holding on to power for personal gain. After his presidency, Mandela became a global icon. His work was far from finished. He founded the Nelson Mandela Foundation, dedicated to fighting against poverty, HIV/AIDS, and promoting human rights. Mandela used his platform to bring attention to global issues, especially those that marginalized the most vulnerable in society. One of his most significant efforts was his work raising awareness about HIV/AIDS, a crisis that was devastating many African countries, including South Africa. He used his influence to break the silence surrounding the epidemic and to call for more global action to combat it. Mandela's wisdom and compassion resonated with people from all walks of life, and leaders from every corner of the world sought his counsel. He met with presidents, kings, and other world leaders, speaking on issues ranging from peace and justice to education and equality. His speeches, filled with personal experiences and universal truths, were met with widespread admiration. His humility and personal story captivated people, making him a voice not just for South Africa, but for the global struggle for human dignity. In recognition of his lifelong commitment to peace and service, July 18, Mandela's birthday, was declared Mandela Day by the United Nations in 2009. The day became a global celebration of service, with people across the world encouraged to spend 67 minutes helping others, 1 minute for each year Mandela dedicated to fighting for justice. Mandela's legacy was no longer confined to his country, it had become a beacon of hope for the entire world. In his later years, Mandela enjoyed a quieter life, spending much of his time with his family. He found solace in the simple joys of life, gardening, reading, and enjoying the company of his grandchildren. His health, however, began to decline, and he started to step back from the public eye. Yet, even in retirement, Mandela's influence was far from over. When he spoke, the world listened. His words were always filled with wisdom, humility, and love, reflecting a life lived in service to others. Mandela understood that retirement was not about disengaging from the world, rather, it was about passing on his knowledge and ensuring that the work he had started would continue long after he was gone. He became a living testament to the power of legacy, showing that the work of a lifetime can be carried on by others, and that true leadership is about inspiring change, even in one's final years. His quiet smile, coupled with his powerful presence, reminded everyone that his journey was not about fame, but about making a difference. One of his most famous quotes became his guiding principle: "What counts in life is not the mere fact that we have lived. It is what difference we have made to the lives of others." Mandela's life had made an immeasurable difference, not only in South Africa but throughout the world. His message of forgiveness, hope, and equality continues to resonate with millions. On December 5, 2013, the world lost one of its most extraordinary figures. Nelson Mandela passed away at the age of 95. The news of his death was met with an outpouring of grief and tributes from people around the globe. Leaders, activists, and ordinary people alike mourned the loss of the man who had changed the world with his courage, compassion, and vision for a better future. Flags were lowered, candles were lit, and songs were sung in honor of his legacy. South Africa and the world came together in a moment of collective sorrow. Yet, even in death, Mandela's spirit continues to inspire. His legacy lives on in the many institutions he created, in the countless individuals whose lives were touched by his words and actions, and in the country he helped build. His name is spoken in classrooms, on street corners, and in the hearts of those who strive for justice, equality, and peace. Nelson Mandela showed the world that freedom is not given, it is earned through love, sacrifice, and unshakable hope. Mandela's life reminds us that one person, with enough courage and compassion, can indeed change the world. His journey, from a young boy in rural South Africa to a global symbol of peace, shows that the fight for justice is never easy, but it is always worth it. His message will live on for generations to come, a testament to the power of human dignity, forgiveness, and the enduring pursuit of freedom.